Okay, yeah, this is just a presentation I put together. I have a PhD in natural resource management from the University of Arizona. And so talking about this stuff has always been a very challenging aspect sometimes, especially in the Western academic world, because I was always felt like I always had to prove something all the time. And so now that I got my PhD, I really don't have to prove anything that much anymore. I can just talk about what I've done here. And so there's been three important developments so far in 2021. First, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, that traditional knowledge of the world's indigenous peoples can be a vital tool to fight and mitigate the growing climate crisis. The second one is the ITEP report that outlines some of the climatic factors on Indian country in the United States. And the last one I think is very important. It's just the startup of the Indigenous Resiliency Center at the University of Arizona, of which I might be a part of starting in the fall of 2022. So the importance of indigenous practices. Why are indigenous practices so important? First of all, indigenous people protect 80% of global biodiversity on only a mere 25% of the planet's land, with less than 5% of the world's population. Now, if you could really think about that, that's a pretty dire statistics in some ways, that we sit on 80% of global biodiversity. My question that I always like to ask is, what happened to the rest of the Earth's land? You know, why doesn't it support that biodiversity anymore? We always have to ask that question first, because that in myself I think is a real challenge for us. Some of these environmental shocks. So what are the reasons that we should look at indigenous practices? First of all, there's just been a rapid increase in forest fires. You know, there's some tribes, you know, that used to have, you know, prescribed burns, that used to carry on their practices, but, you know, under certain federal legislation, they were not allowed to do that anymore. But now I think they're starting to understand why those are important. There's this lack of water due to intense drought. Arizona is pretty bad. You know, in California, in my opinion, because of the population centers, is pretty awful too. Also, this flooding due to extreme weather events, we're seeing that, you know, with the increase in hurricanes and stuff like that. So we need to try to find ways to do this. And this is where indigenous people step in, because at one time in our history, at least here in North America, if not throughout the globe, we have able to overcome some of these challenges. But the lack of recognition has always been our biggest problem. First of all, if you look at just some of the land cover and why these practices continue and why they should be looked at, is that only 2.7% of Indian country has been developed. The rest is what I would argue is in the original state. What I'm doing right now is I'm creating a biodiversity map of Indian country based upon region to just show how much of the original state that we are in. You know, without biodiversity, as most scientists know, you know, we will not have true sustainability. But along with this biodiversity also comes the challenge of creating an infrastructure that will allow us, like everybody else, to help mitigate some of our factors when climate change does arise, and it has. So why are indigenous conservation, land management schemes, and agricultural systems so resilient? This is just a photo looking at a mesa, and you can see my house down there, kind of on the plain down there. Just built out of traditional sandstones. But why are indigenous conservation, land management schemes, and agricultural systems so resilient? First of all, there's been a lot of continuity. This is an example of a photo example of my fields versus the fields that were taken in 1915 versus the ones that I raised here in 2015. You can see that the management schemes have not changed over at least the last 100 years. And I would argue the last 3,000 years since we've been here on the Hopi Reservation in Northern Arizona. I myself am a practitioner. That means I go out and do this every summer. So the techniques that I'm talking about today are ones that I've been practicing since I was a little kid. But just the replication over time, you know, and as scientists, you know, we know that replication matters. And I'll show you that down the line a little bit. First of all, you know, we always have these place-based knowledge systems that are throughout the United States, they're throughout the globe. You know, and all this is passed down from generation to generation. So what I'm really wanting to have happen here is that for the United States to help reinforce our cultures, not instead of like they did in the past and kind of just take them apart, but we want to reinforce what we have learned. And so that's why it's so important. And these place-based knowledge systems are important. If you look at that corn bundle right there on the right-hand side, you can see the cracked ground. This is like in July. We don't receive any rains all the way from April till to the end of July. And so for our corn to thrive in a desert environment in the Southwest surely should tell you that we do have the knowledge in place, and that knowledge is valuable, especially in a drier climate. First of all, one of the biggest things is lack of recognition. How come there's this lack of recognition of these ancient ways of doing things in the environment? There's me right there getting ready to put in some corn for about 2 springs ago. And so we're still using the old dibbles. You know, my buddies used to tell me, he said, why don't you get John Deere and get a 14-row planter? And I said, a 14-row planter on a 2-acre field, that's gonna be crazy, right? So I said, why don't we just get 14 Hopies like we usually do, put John Deere hats on them, and we'll have a 14-row planter. And so anyways, it's kind of cool to look at that. So this lack of recognition, in my opinion, is caused by these different value systems that we look at from Indigenous perspective versus what I would call a Western's perspective. First of all, when I look at the windbreaks, here's an example. When I look at the windbreaks, our additional value system is based upon survival. You know, we use what's out there in order for us, low cost, you know, high labor, but low cost. We use this to survive. We always have been using this to survive. If you look at the opposite picture on the right, that's an economically based value system. Those windbreaks are put in place to, one, help commodity crops, and the other one is to help cattle, you know, both of which they benefit economically from. And I'm not saying there's nothing wrong with that, but I just want to show you for an example that our Indigenous value system is based upon mere survival. So when I look at these Indigenous agricultural knowledge versus the Natural Resource Conservation Service standards, which I used to work for, by the way, as a district conservationist, I kind of stack them up side by side, you know, IAK based versus NRCS based. And when I look at, you know, I talked about the societal norms, but when I talk about the replicability, we have 2,000 years here at Hopi, even longer than that throughout the globe, of this replicability of these management schemes, you know, versus the Natural Resource Conservation Service only has 200 years of that. So some of the barriers that I found out, so what is also the causes of lack of recognition? Well, some of my studies have said that, you know, we have examined conservation incentive programs in less developed countries, but there are only 3 in developing countries. Why is that? We have a big population of Indigenous people here in the United States, but it seems like all the studies and a lot of funding for those studies are done somewhere else. You know, and what I found out is that we have the same problems. We have the same problems exactly: lack of capital, lack of communication. The systems that are set up don't fit to what we would like them to fit for. And so we have the same barriers as developing countries. In the United States, of all places, we still have the same barriers. You know, Indigenous communities in developed countries face similar barriers in Indigenous people in less developed countries. And that was the main point of that. And so this is kind of an example, and I wanted to show this. You know, NRCS has all these standard practices, which on the right side, they are subsidized because they are scientifically proven. In the recent paper that I just got published in the Journal in Water and Soil Conservation Journal says that, let's look at the conservation outcomes. So when I look at our practices, which are put in a holistic fashion, I find out that they have the same conservation outcomes. The same conservation outcomes, except that ours aren't scientifically proven. And that doesn't make sense. So we're missing out on all that federal funding. So we need to work with NRCS in order to change some of their criteria. And that may be changing some of the laws that are out there. So let me give you a couple of examples of this. So when we talk about contour farming, which is basically lining up your crop rows so that they help stop wind and rain erosion. We've been doing this for 2,000 years. It's also called an NRC standard practices. We just don't call it contour farming, right? And so our things are very small as far as scale wise, but still we don't receive any type of funding for doing our practices. Doesn't make sense, because we could use this funding in the long haul to actually just, you know, pay some of our people to increase our capacity. Nutrient management. That's our nutrient management right there. We don't have something out there dragging stuff on the field and putting, you know, whatever they put on the fields. We just allow water to come into our field, bringing new soils and everything else like that. In fact, I have a field that's about 100 years old. pH levels, for those who are in science and crop science, 8.8. And that's perfect for corn, 8.8 after 100 years. I challenge anybody that has a 100-year-old field in the Midwest to come up with the same pH levels without having any new NPK added to their soils. So some of the end goals, first of all, I want to have a more resilient natural resource management schemes. This is not just for me, but for the United States. We need to have more resilient natural resource management schemes. whether it's based upon indigenous knowledge or other things that are out there, as long as they're resilient. We need to have more cost-effective environmental programs. There was an NGO study out about 2 years ago that said that, you know, EQIP and CSP weren't really that cost-effective, and I just didn't know why. There's also this greater communication between indigenous people and the public. I think that's one of the biggest things that is our problem. We don't talk to each other enough. We don't invite indigenous people to the table. I'm glad that Dr. Stone invited me to come today. You know, I really appreciate that. And so that's what I mean by just learning there's a different thing out there. It's not just a one-way street, folks. You know, and also we need to have these more sustainable approaches for managing lands. You know, I can't take our cropping system and put it in Iowa. For one thing, it wouldn't be economically viable. It'd probably drive crazy because they could drive a semi truck through the rows. And ours out here, we can do that, but we don't need to do that. You know, we really know how to manage our lands. You know, I can't change the American value system. I can't change any of that, you know, but I can sure show them that there's something else that's different. Let them ask the question. You know, but I think one of the most important is just having a stronger future for our youth. You know, with climate change and all the stuff that's going on out there, this is one of the main things of why I do what I do, is just to make sure that these little kids that are all holding an ear of corn, which is our mother in the Hopi society, you know, is very important. Very important to give those kids a way to go, you know, especially when it comes to learning this, you know, the fields that they need to learn, like STEM. And I'm able to integrate that into our traditional practices. So with that kind of short presentation, I just want to thank everybody. My contact information's on the bottom, you know, and so if you want to ever contact me about these things, let me know. Or look me up on YouTube or whatever. Have a beautiful Welcome to Indigenous Day video that I just put out there. But other than that, you know, it's just great to be here and great to see all the different people here today. And thank you very much. I really appreciate that.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Michael. It's an excellent presentation. A lot to think about right there. Yeah, I think everyone really enjoyed that. This will be a bit of a challenge working with some questions, but we did leave time for questions. So I'll introduce the strategy here, and then I'll pose my own first question to get things started. The strategy is I'm going to be watching for people to use the little hand raising icon. So I have everybody up, and I'll look for it, and I'll try to catch people kind of in the order that people put their hands up. But to kick it off, Michael, I was wondering, what has the personal interaction or dialogue been with USDA, and what kind of reaction have you gotten from people, or what has allowed you to kind of get a breakthrough so that you can get the feds actually listening to these perspectives that are very far from the traditional USDA perspective on agriculture, as you pointed out?
Well, I think a lot of it has to do with what we saw this last year was just the decrease in the supply chain. You know, that was one of the biggest things. The other thing is that my works are getting published, and so that's also important. I'm able to go to different venues and give talks like this, and so that wakes people to, because nobody likes to be, you know, criticized or blamed. The other thing is too, you know, we've got a Native American who runs the Office of General Counsel, Janie Hipp, my former boss, and so we also got a Native who runs the Farm Service Agency. So when you have those two people in those organizations, you're able to help move things around in a good way, and get the attention that you need. And so, because, you know, our organization was found out after the Keepseagle settlement, which was basically a discriminatory settlement. And so out of that bore our organization. And so, you know, I am getting the attention that I need. It's just that, you know, I just like to have more of people like myself be at the table when big policy decisions are discussed. So thank you.
Excellent. I'm not seeing any other hands up. I've got all kinds of questions, but also I realize there's now 3 screens that I need to scroll across. If someone does have a question, go ahead and pipe up, because I'm not seeing anybody with their hands raised. Otherwise, I have one more follow-up. So, I mean, I think you hit a really vital issue right on the head, Michael, when you were talking about the credibility concept.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering what your perspective is on, you took a very arduous route of going through a traditional Western PhD in order to get these people who are in the establishment to respect and listen to your perspectives. Do you see alternative mechanisms where we can try to elevate these other viewpoints and knowledge systems without you know, the need to put the Western seal of approval on it in order to get people to listen?
Well, there's, you know, they're like the Indian Agricultural Council. They have a regen seal that they're trying to get promoted, and that kind of shows that's kind of tags along with that some of the environmental practices. So, like if an Indian producer is using his own environmental practices, or some that are like regenerative agriculture, they're able to use that seal. It's like an organic seal. It has to make its way through the copyright status and all the stuff like that. But that's one way. The other way is just you know, to introduce, you know, indigenous agriculture in the mainstream classrooms. You know, we don't talk about it that much. We talk about everything else, but we don't talk about it in mainstream classrooms. For example, I worked with a little group out of Manzanita Hall in Tucson, and they were doing a drought experiment versus they were mimicking the biosphere projects that they have down there, and their seeds wouldn't come up, and I felt so bad for them. So I said, oh, let's go get some of my seeds. And so they came up within a couple of weeks, and those kids' eyes lit up. So it's, you know, it's all about that. I explained to them where the seeds were from, why they're so important, why biodiversity is so important, and let it kind of go like that. Because, you know, I think that's where things are going to change, is that when the kids start to see that, and we see that today. We see our youth starting to speak up and be more active, but they too need to have a place at the table too. And well, that's how I kind of approach that. But thanks a lot.
Oh, excellent. Thank you so much, Michael. I think we have time for one more question, and I see Professor Bahara from our economics department here at UNM has his hand up, so I'll let him pose one last question.
Just a quick thank you for this presentation, pretty good. And just the observation that I am originally from Nepal, and I do a lot of these kinds of sort of research field projects in Nepal, including disaster, water quality, food security, and so on. And just speaking of the indigenous sort of involvement, I don't know if it's quite like that, but Nepal has close to 22% of its physical area under all kinds of national forests and parks and preserves. So it's one of the highest. And one of the things that the country did about 40 years ago is to hand over a lot of forests to the community forestry groups. So, and that has been one of the successes. We don't see anything else happening in other areas, but that community forest has been pretty successful in terms of involving the community, in terms of, you know, allocation of fodder and you know, cutting of wood and replantation. So they have to go through that. So I just want, and there are about, I don't know, 16,000 community forest groups, gone up to 20 now. So that's one of the kind of highlights involving the local people. I just want to share with you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. You know, here, you know, kind of a side to that question is that, you know, we have tribal forests here in the United States, and they are the best managed forests, bar none, here in the United States. They succeed the national trend, they succeed the state trend and the private trend. Mainly because one is that they're not based upon economics, but tribes do benefit economically. It's just how they manage them that allows them to do that. They are, like you were saying, Professor, is that they are, you know, they're managed by the community, and so everybody has a buy-in. And when you have a buy-in to something, it's like a co-op. You know, you're getting more involved in it, and so that's important. But, you know, my main goal is, first of all, is to bring recognition to that we're still here. You know, we're not just a museum piece that you see when you go to the museum. In that, you know, our ways of life should be valued. They should be reinforced throughout the United States and the globe. And that also involves bringing in infrastructure so that we have the things we need, because in reality we really don't. And so that's what I will leave it at that. But thank you so much for letting me talk today.